My name is Atikh Bana. I'm a product designer at Datadog, and today we're going to be talking about research in the command line interface. So we're going to be spending 30 minutes together, so I figured I'd probably give you a little lay of the land with how we're going to be spending that time. So to kick us off, I'll talk a little bit about myself, then we'll move into what a command line is, then we'll talk a little bit about why this matters to you. We'll move into learning the fly. I promise that will make more sense later. We'll talk about defining success, making a way, and bringing it all together at the end. But first, a little bit about me. I'm a designer and researcher that cares a lot about research in technical spaces. I spent all of my professional life designing and researching for technical audiences. Most recently, I was the lead product designer and researcher at Storage Labs, which is a cloud storage platform for developers, where I worked on both graphical user interfaces and command line user interfaces. These days, I'm a product designer at Datadog, where I'm working on authentication, APIs, and access control. But for purposes of this talk, let's just say that I'm still doing research and design in technical tools. So now that we're past a little bit about me, I want to talk a little bit about what a CLI is. So the CLI is the original computer interface, the command line interface. It's the original way that we communicated with a computer. It doesn't have all the visual cues and affordances and interaction design, and all the other things that we have today that help us, use these computer devices. Instead, it only has two things. First being syntax, which is words or abbreviations that you put together, and semantics, which is the relationships that occur between those words and abbreviations that you put together. So I'm going to give you a little example of a command line and how you might use it with storage, for example. It starts off as this black screen on your computer. If you're on a Mac, you can open it up by just typing terminal. If you're on a Windows, command prompt will open that black box up on your machine. But if you're using it in the context of storage, for example, the first thing you would type is uplink, which is the name of the command line interface that you want to use. And let's say that you wanted to create a folder or bucket on the storage network. You would type the abbreviation MB, which is short for make bucket. And you would follow that up with SJ:// let's say cakes. And what that means is that you want to make a bucket on the storage network and you want to call it cakes. And so you would hit enter, and bam, the computer would return bucket cakes created. And that's a quick little example of how it works with the storage network. But if you don't want to download the storage command line interface, and I don't blame you if you don't want to download it, but a simple thing you can try is just open up the command line and type say, S-A-Y, and write out a sentence or write out your name and hit enter, and the computer's going to talk to you. So that's a little bit about the command line interface. But now I want to get into something a little more important, which is why this talk even matters to you. So I hope, by now most of you have your monocles on with your hands on your chin, and you're wondering, why does this matter? And I'm really glad that you're wondering. So I am going to be talking about research in the command line interface. But this really is a talk that extends that. This is a talk that applies to technical tools and products at large. There's a really great need for user experience researchers like yourselves in spaces like this. And we need more of you to actually help, do the research in these spaces. Whether that's in developer tools with me at Datadog, whether that's in medical devices that enable our healthcare professionals to keep us healthy and to monitor us and all the other things that they do when we're at the hospital or at home. Whether that's in robotics or in manufacturing where, people are interacting with these machines and products that are helping to build and manufacture all the things that we regularly use on a daily basis. Or even airplane cockpits that help ensure that pilots are able to safely get us to the places that we need to go. And I also love airplanes, and the cockpit is also a really great analogy for the command line interface, so I'll continue to reference it throughout this talk. But the reason why I think it's such a great analogy is because the cockpit also appears, very technical and advanced to, a person like me or you. But after the extensive practice and training that the pilots go through, it becomes, a regular thing that they use on a constant basis, and a familiar dashboard for them. It becomes a tool that allows them to accomplish the task of flying a plane, but with more efficiency, safety, and productivity. And, similarly, the command line appears very technical and advanced, right? You might be looking at it thinking, am I watching The Matrix or something like that, right? But, after the extensive practice and training that developers and software engineers and site reliability engineers go through, the command line becomes a simple tool that allows them to, manage their servers, spin up more servers, deal with storage and all sorts of other things, and debug. But it allows them to do it with a greater level of productivity, efficiency, and safety as well. So a little thought experiment for all of you would be to go and ask one of your developer friends which they prefer. Do they prefer to use the command line interface, or do they prefer to use a graphical user interface? And there's a great likelihood that they're going to say the command line for some of the reasons that we just talked about. But I want to come back to the airplane cockpit and tell you a story about the Second World War. During the war, many pilots were trained on one particular cockpit design to only then have to operate a different one on the job. So for example, in some cockpits, the flight stick, you pulled back on the flight stick if you wanted the plane to ascend, and others, you pulled forward if you wanted the plane to ascend. Coupling this with a bunch of other, differences in these cockpit designs, it led to a lot of human error and unfortunately many deaths of these pilots. And researchers were kind of tasked to sort of figure out how this could be improved. This wasn't ideal, right? We don't want people dying on the job. And so this actually gave rise to human factors engineering, or human factors research and design, and aviation psychology. These are all terms that are sort of intertwined and really apply to the things that we do today. And, this is sort of the start to a lot of the methodologies that we, use now, was kind of born out of this era of human factors design and research as it relates to the cockpit. Research has really aided a ton in helping to improve the reduction of pilot error, and helping to increase the productivity and safety and comfort for pilots. And, while they weren't the only ones that were in charge of, having these strides and improvements and safety and all these other things, they certainly played a significant impact on the cockpit and what it is today. And actually, one of the researchers that were a part of that was Paul Fitts, who you might all recognize for Fitts' Law. But the point that I really want to make was that, the researchers that worked to help make these great strides in the cockpit and help, improve all the things that we talked about, they weren't pilots. And, me working in this space of technical tools for developers and command lines, I'm not a developer either, but yet both of us are able to have this impact on these problem spaces by not actually being experts in the products themselves. And the reason why this talk matters to you is because, that's actually an advantage, the fact that we don't know. Because we all have opinions about the products and tools that we regularly use. And, we have a sense of what the pain points are and things that we want to change about these products. You take Spotify, for example, Twitter, Airbnb, and so on. But it's actually a great thing that we don't know, because it helps alleviate, that bias that we normally carry when we walk into these familiar spaces. And that's actually an advantage, because we can just come in with such an open mind and really have some great impact on these problem spaces. So I hope by now, you're listening and you're thinking, hey, maybe I could be in technical spaces. And you totally can. And so with that, I want to transition, and I want to talk to you about my first tip, which is learning how to fly. That might have been a little exaggeration. I'm not going to teach you how to fly in 30 minutes because I actually don't know how to fly, and I don't know how you could learn how to fly in 30 minutes. But the point I really want to make is that, if you're researching for the cockpit, you don't necessarily need to be a pilot, but you really need to gain an understanding of what it takes to make a plane fly. What is a pilot doing in order to make a plane fly? And similarly, for the command line, I don't have to be a developer, but if my product is the command line, I should totally have a sense of how that works, and with time, I should be able to learn how to use it. In my early days at Storage, we actually didn't have our own command line interface. It was still being built out. And so this was a great opportunity for me to go out and learn from all of our competitor command line interfaces. And I totally did not know like what was going on for the longest period of time, and it took a lot of like research and asking questions and YouTube videos, so on and so forth. But eventually this command line started to make a little more sense to me. And what I would do at this point was put together these journey maps that documented all the steps that I would take going through these command line interfaces. And I obviously didn't have a sense of what some of those high and low points were. So I would put together these just these journey maps that I would then share with engineers to help me make sense of that. Was that a positive step? Was that a negative step? Was there an opportunity that you see here for us to maybe improve, or a thing that we may be able to copy even? And so this was a really great exercise for me to just kind of build up my, quote unquote, flying knowledge, and really helped me when it finally came time to, make motion with the command line that we created. And so eventually, we had our own command line interface. And, at this point, it really, was about learning from our own users. And, while the immersion from learning from the competitor tools was great, the truest form of immersion when it comes to technical products is going to be usability testing. Once we had our command line interface at Storage, it became the primary usability, or the primary research method for us. In technical products, nothing is going to be usability testing. I mean, I know they are the most time-consuming research methodologies, but to truly understand how your users are interacting with your technical product, you just have to, observe them and ask them, prompts to go through your technical product. Interviews and surveys just simply can't be as effective, nor can relying on engineers or, product managers to sort of tell you, what the users would expect or how they would react to something. And so, during World War II, a lot of the key insights that these researchers gained from pilots actually came from, being in the cockpit with the pilots and having them sort of do their own form of like usability testing in those environments. And it was really important for them, and it was really important for me when I was working through the work of the command line. Usability testing is how you build your mental models. It's how you really understand your users in these technical spaces. And they're going to tell you a lot more than having your users, explain to you how they would interact with something or how they do interact with something. And now I want to share a good example of usability testing that we did at Storage, where, we found this common behavior among our developers from this first round of usability testing. So here goes that clip.
That's not my satellite address. Oops. Okay. So I'm assuming if I press enter, it will just default to home.
So I know you probably are like, I don't know exactly what just happened in that. So I'm going to try to make a little more sense of that all. So the user was going through setting up the command line interface for the first time, the uplink command line interface that I spoke about earlier. And so as a part of setup, the user has to input a few credentials, right? It's kind of like, when you're signing up for an account online, your username, password, et cetera, right? So the first thing that the user has to put in is something called the satellite address. And simply put, it's the server location of that user's account, among many other things. And so the user should put in something like, US Central 1 or Asia Pacific 1, it's all based on the satellite that they chose upon creation. But I could totally feel, very empathetic for the user going through this step, because right before they actually were in the command line interface, they were in the graphical user interface, our dashboard. And in that dashboard, they were given an API key that they were told that they were going to need to use inside of the command line. And so typically what users do when they get to this step is they copy that API key and they put it in like a notes file or something, or put it in like a LastPass or something so that they can reference it later in the command line. And so the problem is, the user, goes through setting up this, or goes through like download or getting the API key, and now they're prompted to enter something in the command line. And so what's their immediate thought? What they just did was to grab that API key that they just saved and paste that in. Developers are all about efficiency and speed. So they thought to just grab that and then paste it in. And of course, that wasn't the right thing. And this became a common mistake that users were making in the usability testing. And the second thing is, you heard him say something about, defaulting to none, or, if I press enter, will it default to none? And so usually in command lines, you're able to sort of, when you're prompted to enter something, in some cases you can just hit enter and it will set the default value. But the problem is that this user's account exists on a specific satellite, so they actually can't do that. They have to pick a specific satellite because we don't know which one that they're using. And so this just led to even more friction. And so after seeing this repeatedly confuse users in our usability testing, we collaborated with engineering to come up with a new approach. And so this new approach was simply showing the user numerical choices. So, instead of enter your satellite address, it was like, which satellite, are you using? And you had to pick like 1, 2, or 3, which gave them the options. And so instead of having this open-ended input, the users are prompted to pick an option. And so once they recall, the satellite that they're using, they simply pick that number. And this approach ended up working so much better. And it saved a ton of time and confusion, which was validated by further usability testing. The challenge with spaces like the command line and some other technical tools is that, there really is a difficulty in automating the gathering of quantitative and qualitative data. There really isn't a Google Analytics for the command line or a full story script that allows you to record what's going on inside of that user's terminal. And so the setup step that we, solved the friction around could have been going on like that for a while, and we would have never noticed it without, doing some usability testing. And because developers are natural problem solvers, they would have figured this out and maybe never even call attention to it. But that's added friction to the user's experience that we could make better. And so it was a great way that we could use, it was a great thing that we could use usability testing to help uncover this so much earlier and make this improvement. But before I move on, I have a confession to make. The lessons that you're going to gather from this talk aren't going to teach you anything new about user experience research. Instead, they're really just going to give you some insight into how you can tweak the processes and methodologies and flows that we normally use in these spaces to help us better work in technical spaces. So with that, let's keep going. And I want to talk now a little bit about, defining success. We talked a little bit about learning to fly, immersion, usability testing, and now I want to talk about defining success. So typically, just like in other spaces, benchmarking is how you define and find success. But what's unique about, benchmarking in technical spaces different from, non-technical spaces. Non-technical spaces have this priority of like, how long are we able to keep users on a page? How much time are they spending on the website? How many buttons are they clicking? Or how many pages are they clicking through to? How much data are they uploading? How many minutes are they playing video? It's all about bigger and bigger numbers. There's a great focus on optimizing for greater and greater engagement. But in technical spaces, you're optimizing for the opposite. Benchmarking is generally about increasing efficiency, productivity, and reducing human error, which all generally have to deal with a reduction of time. It's all about lowering numbers, right? So how can we reduce the amount of time it takes a pilot, using the cockpit controls to land a plane? How have we reduced the amount of time it takes a developer to work through the most important part of the command line interface? In the case of a cockpit, if getting a system to perform a crucial action takes too long, time can become a life or death situation. And in the case of a command line, if a developer can't debug fast enough or move quickly enough, it could really prolong major outages and cause all types of damage. The video I showed earlier, where the developer was struggling through the satellite address prompt, had the user just read the documentation, they would have noticed this and figured out exactly what they needed to do. And this is the engineering and technical writing way of solving problems in this space, right? Guiding the users through the setup, but clearly it wasn't working. And so after the change where the user actually selected from the list of satellites, so when we went from that open-ended field to like the numerical choice, this went from a step that was taking users about 20 seconds in the usability testing with guidance to less than 10 without any guidance. And so it's all about those small measurable wins when it comes to benchmarking in these non-technical spaces. When it comes to benchmarking in these technical spaces. Engineering might be optimizing for the tool's performance, making things more lightweight, making, things smaller, but we also need to be optimizing for the humans using the tool performance. And this is certainly challenging to do in the command line because there really isn't a great way to measure, in real life, the time it takes a user to go through this. And as a workaround, really focusing on time as a measure in our usability testing was a great way to benchmark and is something that we continuously use at Storage. And this is something that should consistently be monitored. Heavy quantitative benchmarking is how you will find success and how you continue to define and find it. So that's a little bit about defining success. Now I want to talk a little bit about making a way. Typically, as UXR folks, our workflows might look something like, user experience research is working with product design or experience design and, product management. And, we're kind of all collaborating in the ways that we're used to, right? You're exploring iterations based on the insights that we provided with the design team, or, we're helping to set product priority with research that we're doing with, PM. But what's unique about highly technical spaces is that sometimes you don't even get called on to help bring these insights to the table, or the decisions are just being made by the highly technical folks, and the iterations normally rest on them. So for example, design and research does not typically get involved in the command line interface. It's developers building for developers, and that's kind of the mantra that's followed, right? And so the circle of feedback normally will stay with that group. And so at storage, it took breaking into groups and conversations that typically didn't involve me. It meant engineering managers, software engineers, and the PMs that were setting the engineering priorities. Second, it's really a different way of working than we're used to. It's a different way of doing product management, project management, prioritization, and it's a different type of persistence to make sure that your feedback is getting acted on. Constantly being told that this can't be worked on right now, that it's too difficult, or that this isn't important right now. But a big part of being a researcher in these technical spaces is that we sometimes need to step out of that research role and really make sure that our insights get followed through to fruition. So at storage, another early step of the usability testing was users downloading the uplink CLI. And so it had a name, when you download it, like uplink_Darwin_AMD64.zip, right? And so it sounds really long, and the user would have to download this. And this this command line, zipped file would go into their downloads folder, right? When you download something on Google Chrome, and it defaults to your downloads folder. And so the user would have to extract it, and then they'd have to run it, right? And so, there was a lot of friction that existed in that workflow, because typically CLI is installed at the root directory. So meaning you can just open up the terminal and type in the CLI name right away. But when it downloads to your downloads folder, you have to open up your terminal, and you have to type in CD, which is the acronym for change directory, and then space downloads, and then you'd have to type in the CLI name after that. And so it was just extra steps to getting the CLI even working on your machine. And so that was just added friction. And comparing that to when it downloads to the root directory, it's just one step. You open the command line up and you just type in the CLI. And the other thing was that, like I mentioned earlier, it had this really long name, uplink_Darwin, and that just really added more work and added more time spent. And it's also just more error prone, right? Because you have to make sure that you're spelling it right, or the users also would maybe type it in fully once, and then the second time they just remember the first word, and so they try to type the first word, and so there were a lot of errors that were occurring at this step. And so in comparison to our competitor, if you wanted to use the AWS CLI, you simply just type, you open your terminal and you type AWS, and you type in your subcommands and you're working. And so, it was this combination of about 5 extra steps without any user error when, working through this, and added 1 to 2 steps when users were making errors. In comparison with our competitors, it was as simple as, downloading or copying a command into your terminal, which downloaded the CLI into your root folder, and it was working right away. So, 2 steps versus the 5 that we talked about for the storage one. And so after calling attention to this with our stakeholders, it was met with pushback that it would be very technical to do this, to make this change the way that Amazon has it. And that it wasn't really important, and that technical users should be able to figure it out, or move the command line to the root directory if that's what they want. And while this is true, usability testing proved that even the most technical users were making these very human errors. And the challenge here is that it turned out that this iterative improvement that I was trying to advocate for wouldn't be worth the engineering investment. And it totally could have been something that I led up on, but this should be a priority. Because like we talked about, designing or technical tools are about increasing efficiency and reducing human error. And this has to be a priority, because that's exactly what we're doing by making this change. So what do I do, right? I'm turned down, and I'm maybe lost a little morale. Like, how do I move? And so, there existed other solutions to this problem that just took engaging with folks that I normally didn't. And so after some conversations with some engineering folks, we had some alternative ideas. And it turns out that we can write this makeshift command that we could put into our documentation that the user could just copy into their terminal. And that greatly reduced the steps for the user. And so we wrote this like command. It was a bit long, but obviously, you know, there's like a copy button in the documentation that the users can click. They can copy that command, paste it into their terminal or the command line. What it would do is that it would extract the command line zip file, and it would rename it to just be uplink, so it didn't have to be the uplink underscore blah 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 blah. And it would also move it from your downloads folder into your root directory. And so it's so much easier to use later on, and it solved the problem without much engineering. I mean, it took about an hour or two with this one engineer that I work with to make this makeshift solution. This isn't, you know, a jab at engineering either. You know, they were totally on the right track of how, you know, it was difficult to do. You know, the thing that they were talking about was building out, like, or having this be part of a package manager. So for example, you know, that's even simpler. You could open up your terminal window and you could type something like npm install uplink. So just 3 words, and that would download it all and download and put it in your root folder and all of this. And while that's the ideal experience and something we could totally like march towards, it's something that shouldn't hinder us from solving the user problem today. And that's exactly what we did. And it was great that we were able to come together to find this perfect solution that really addressed the friction that we uncovered through our testing. And so this was a flow that went from like 5 to 6 steps down to 3. And, you know, while arriving to this solution, you know, wasn't a linear or familiar flow for me, there was a solution found at the end. And, you know, the iteration was super helpful, and it helped shave off more than 20 seconds from the setup step for our users. And, you know, going back to the small measurable wins, that's huge. And, you know, while the process to getting the changes implemented aren't always desirable, as researchers, it's really our responsibility to make sure that great insights get acted on and truly be the voice for our users. It took a long time for me to learn, but became really important in my work at Storage. We're kind of coming towards the end here, and you know, we talked about a lot. And you know, if you've been able to focus all the way through, that is awesome and beats the ability that I have. I can't even focus for this long. But if you've missed a few parts of this, I just want to recap all the important things that I really want you to take away from this talk. First, highly technical spaces need folks like you. We really do. I mean, you're all so talented, and there's such a great need for you in this space, in these spaces. Second, don't be afraid by the fact that you don't know. You know, I've had conversations with friends all the time about the work that I'm doing at Datadog, and they're like, oh, I don't know if I'm technical enough to be in this space. No, it's a great thing that you don't know. Take advantage of that. Walk into these spaces with an open mind and help us all see things so differently, because that's exactly what we need. Third, usability testing is going to tell us everything that we need to know in technical spaces. I know that it's just a lot of work, and I know that it's not always the most fun thing to like get, you know, logistically set up, but it's super important for us to do this work, and it's important that we do that. And the other thing is that, you know, the most important benchmark for us is time, and success really comes down to how we're reducing time in technical spaces. And lastly, you know, make sure that, you know, as researchers, that we really advocate for the user, and we're making sure that our insights get you know, through to fruition, even when the paths to that don't look so linear. Those are all really important. And so, you know, while the Airbnbs and the Facebook of the world need folks like us, so do technical products. And, you know, this is a conference filled with folks, researchers that are way smarter than me. And each one of you is not only capable of doing this work with greatness, but you can also bring incredible impact to the really important tools and products that make the world go round. And if I can be of any resource to any of you along your journeys, or even just be a springboard to talk about research in technical spaces, please don't hesitate to reach out, because I would love to help make this be your reality if it's something that you're interested in. Thank you so much for listening to this talk, and I really hope that there were things for you to take away from this.